Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. Daniel Greenfield is a Shillman Journalism Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and this week he wrote that while Joe Biden condemns quote-unquote violence, he won't condemn its perpetrators. Daniel joins me now. So in the previous segment, I played a barrage of clips of the media demanding Donald Trump condemn white supremacy, which he has done repeatedly over the last several years. Why won't Joe Biden condemn Black Lives Matter and Antifa?
He absolutely cannot condemn them because they're a sizable part of his base. Antifa is a more narrower group, but when you look at the organizers and the people who actually show up, who actually do door knocking, who actually serve in campaign infrastructure, as we've seen, for example, in Project Veritas videos, a whole bunch of those people are well to the radical left. If they aren't personally Antifa, they're supporters of them. And when it comes to Black Lives Matter, that is a huge chunk of the Democrat infrastructure as well. Again, while polls are showing that support for Black Lives Matter are very much fading among Americans in general, among Democrats, they're still standing very strong. Among black voters, they're still overall pretty strong. There's been a minimal loss, but we're talking single digits as far as percentages go, whereas within the country at large, there's been a pretty complete reversal. So Joe Biden absolutely cannot afford to condemn them. So what he's doing is he's playing the cynical game where he condemns violence, and nobody in the media, of course, asks him what he means by violence. Whose violence is he condemning? Violence doesn't just come out of thin air. Somebody perpetrates the violence. When he actually discusses who's perpetrating the violence, then he talks about police violence, he talks about violence from all sides, and of course he talks about right-wing violence. So he's not actually condemning violence coming from his supporters.
Well, and what we saw this week during the first presidential debate was that President Trump was again, and I played it in the last segment, he was again called on to denounce white supremacy and in these different various organizations, and he said, give me a name and I'll do it. I mean, it doesn't seem to me like he's exactly trying to hide that. But the media, Chris Wallace specifically, they're not holding Joe Biden to the same standard. We all know that the media is biased, but is there something beyond just simply the bias?
Well, it's beyond bias. It's a structural problem because the media is very much on the side of one of the sides in this combat. So Black Lives Matter has been completely thoroughly mainstreamed, endorsed, supported, and not just by the official Democrat campaign infrastructure, but very much by the media, by, for that matter, Fortune 500 companies. And when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we really mean black nationalism. Black Lives Matter is just one of the expressions of black nationalist movements, and those are movements that believe that white people are evil, believe that black people are in some way special, and that we need to fundamentally shift power from one to the other, not equality, not Martin Luther King's content of character. That's something they specifically disavow. When you look at Black Lives Matter founders, the people they quote are Shacha Shakur, also known as Joan Chestnut, was a violent, racist, she's a fugitive in Cuba, a violent, racist terrorist who supported black nationalist movements and was willing to kill and die for them. That is their model. That is their entire agenda. So on the other hand, you have these condemnations of white nationalism, white supremacy. And on the other hand, you have outright endorsements and support for black nationalism and black supremacy. And that is something Republicans really need to be able to call out. It's an area where they fundamentally failed to do so.
Why do you think they've failed to do that?
In some cases, it's a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of information. In others, they're very weary. They've been called racist so many times, they don't want to touch the subject. And in a way, there's really no sense of history. So to understand where Black Lives Matter came from, you have to look at black militant movements, black nationalist movements in the 60s and the 70s. And we're increasingly seeing a new generation that has lost touch with that history, unfortunately. And it's very important to bring that up again, which is one of the things I try to do in that essay.
Well, and I think one of the most disturbing developments in this whole, debate that we've seen play out this week is that it seems to me that Fox News has even fallen into this trap. And we saw John Roberts on Thursday. He was peppering Kayleigh McEnany at the White House about, is the president going to explicitly, on my terms, condemn white supremacy and all of that nonsense. And then he has this meltdown on camera that, he's unhappy that people are sending him messages on Twitter and he doesn't care and he thinks this is an important question and all of that. If Fox News is even heading in that direction, who is there out there to be able to say this is the reality of the situation, and this whole idea that Trump won't condemn white supremacy and all of this nonsense is a canard. Who's out there to set the record straight?
Well, we are, for one thing. I mean, when we say even Fox News behind the cameras, I'm sure you know, is run by the same people who, for the most part, run ABC and NBC and CBS. I mean, they're dipping into the same pool of talent. And Fox News, some of the people on camera may be more conservative, but the real problem with the media, again, is structural, which is not just bias, it's that they drive the narrative. They decide which stories are important, which things do we talk about. For months and months, they insisted that the story of national riots, of so many businesses being destroyed, people being beaten, injured, and killed. Again, hundreds and hundreds of police officers have been wounded in these black nationalist riots. That was not a story that was worth discussing. But climate change is, of course, very worth discussing, and structural racism is very worth discussing. And, things like this, insisting that President Trump is really a white supremacist is very worth discussing.
How did we get to this point in society where when there is going to be an announcement, last week is a good example of the Kentucky Attorney General announces what the grand jury had decided in the Breonna Taylor case. And, of course, the reaction, for whatever reason, is violence, is destruction, looting, burning, shooting police, etc. How did we get to that place in society?
Well, we got to it because we empowered radical groups. This is something that actually goes back early in the 20th century. Actually, as a matter of fact, the use of race riots as a political weapon goes back well into the 19th century as far as the Democrats are concerned. But this is something that increasingly radical leftist groups were teaming up with black nationalists 100 years ago to do this, for example, in New York during the Harlem riots. So this is something that they've had a lot of experience in doing, and they have a lot of experience in finding favorable media. The big shifts that we're seeing in the polls really involve, first of all, Republicans. Getting Republicans to actually, majority of Republicans take a negative view of Black Lives Matter is very much a recent phenomenon. Kenosha was a major turning point for a lot of people in general. So you now have Republicans and independents turning on Black Lives Matter, Democrats hardly at all. And this is really a lesson in what happens if you don't counter the lie just first up the moment it comes out of the gate. When you wait for it to go over the top, then it's much harder to put a stop to it. This is just a larger lesson of history. Once a lie gets embedded, once people actually get committed to it, it's much harder to stop it.
We've only got a couple seconds left, but when you say the Democrats use rioting and all of that as a political tool, what are they hoping the outcome is going to be?
Well, if you go back to one of the biggest race riots in American history, those were the draft riots. They were carried out by white Democrats against Republicans and black people to prevent President Lincoln from being reelected. So it's very much the same game. They create chaos, they create anarchy, they frighten people, and they send people the messages of something that Biden has been doing, Kamala Harris have been doing. If you want the violence and the chaos to stop, you have to put the Democrats in charge. This is their message, and they're not being called on it, which is also a huge problem. I hope that at a future debate, President Trump actually confronts Biden with it, confronts Kamala Harris with it, and actually confronts Kamala Harris with the fact that she contributed to a bail fund that bailed out an attempted cop killer.
Mm-hmm. Daniel Greenfield, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
This is the Kyle Olson Show. We'll be right back.